Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unraveling the story of history's most brilliant, yet deeply tragic, Renaissance mind. We often think of historical geniuses as these monolithic figures of pure intellect, just sitting quietly in candlelit studies. But the reality? Well, it's often much darker, much more chaotic, and honestly, infinitely more fascinating. Today, we're looking at a man whose towering intellect was matched only by his absolutely devastating personal demons. Okay, let's dive right into this. Take a look at this beautifully restored 1553 medallion portrait of Jerome Cardano, or as he's known in Italian, Gerolamo Cardano. Notice how those sharp, clean, black and white lines really bring his likeness right out of the faded original pages. He looks distinguished, right? Regal and completely composed at age 48. But that composed exterior masks a life of absolute extremes. He wasn't just some detached scholar. He was a survivor, navigating this crazy world of profound intellectual discovery and incredibly cutthroat personal survival. Here is the crucial paradox we're dealing with today. Cardano was arguably the absolute most famous physician of his day and a mathematician whose breakthroughs literally changed the course of algebra. Yet, he was also a compulsive, fiercely self-destructive gambler. It's this dual life, this epic clash between the rigorous, logical mind of a scientist and the chaotic, uncontrollable impulses of an addict that makes his story so incredibly compelling.
Part 1. The Renaissance Paradox.
To truly get Cardano, we have to look at the staggering contrast between what he produced for the world and the absolute disaster that was his personal life. On one hand, you have this literal monument to human productivity. Cardano published 131 books. That is over 7,000 folio pages covering medicine, mathematics, physics, philosophy, you name it. But on the flip side, his life was just steeped in tragedy from the very beginning. It started with his illegitimate birth, which actually barred him from the medical college in Milan at first. But the absolute darkest shadow fell in 1560. His favorite son, Giambattista, was executed for poisoning his unfaithful wife Brandonia with arsenic. Cardano literally poured his wealth and his soul into defending his son, but he failed. Add to this another son, Aldo, who was just a complete delinquent, and Cardano's own eventual trial and imprisonment by the Inquisition. His intellectual triumphs were constantly, inevitably eclipsed by unspeakable grief and scandal. Part 2. The Star Physician. Despite the utter chaos of his personal life, in the professional realm, Cardano was an absolute rock star. He stood right alongside legendary anatomists like Vesalius. And this next story brilliantly illustrates his practical genius. Back in 1552, Cardano made this grueling journey all the way up to Edinburgh, Scotland. Archbishop John Hamilton was suffering from debilitating, life-threatening asthma, and the absolute best doctors in Europe had completely failed to cure him. So Cardano arrives, simply observes the Archbishop's environment, and issues this surprisingly simple two-step prescription. Step 1, remove the Archbishop's luxurious feather bedding. Step 2, replace it with unspun silk and linen. And guess what? The Archbishop was cured almost immediately. Without even knowing the modern mechanics of it, Cardano had successfully identified an environmental allergen. He essentially founded allergy medicine right there in the 16th century, something millions of us rely on today. And as you can imagine, it brought him massive fame and a very massive fee. But as is often the case, Cardano's immense success fueled his hubris, particularly when it came to his role as a medical astrologer. On his way back from Scotland, he actually cast a horoscope for the young, sickly King Edward VI of England. Cardano confidently predicted a long life for the king, even specifying certain illnesses he'd survive well into his 50s. Well, Edward VI died the very next year, at age 15. But instead of just admitting he made a mistake, Cardano wrote this incredibly clever, elaborate rationalization explaining exactly why his initial astrological math was technically correct, but, thwarted by other celestial factors. It highlights this really fascinating blind spot in a man who otherwise demanded absolute rigorous scientific proof. Part 3. The Great Cubic Feud. Let's move to and see how this builds, because medicine and astrology aren't actually what secured Cardano's most famous spot in the history books. That honor belongs to his mathematics, and specifically to one of the most dramatic, totally cutthroat intellectual feuds of the entire Renaissance. The holy grail of 16th century math was solving the cubic equation, specifically x cubed plus bx equals c. A mathematician named Niccolo Tartaglia figured it out, but he kept it as a fiercely guarded secret. Cardano literally begged Tartaglia for the solution, swearing a solemn oath never to publish it. Tartaglia finally yielded. However, Cardano later discovered that another mathematician, Scipione del Ferro, had actually solved it way back in 1515, long before Tartaglia. So, feeling released from his oath because Tartaglia wasn't the original discoverer, Cardano went ahead and published the solution in his 1545 masterpiece, the Ars Magna. Naturally, Tartaglia was furious. This sparked a bitter, highly public feud that ultimately culminated in Cardano's brilliant student Ludovico Ferrari ruthlessly defeating Tartaglia in a public mathematical duel. Now, it's super easy to paint Cardano as just a thief in this story, but honestly, that would be entirely unfair. Once he actually had that foundational secret, Cardano pushed the boundaries of algebra far beyond what Tartaglia or Del Ferro had ever done. He developed solutions for general cubics. He was one of the very first mathematicians to recognize and actually dare to calculate with imaginary numbers, those square roots of negative numbers that literally everyone else dismissed as impossible. He also discovered the fundamental relationships linking the roots of an equation to its coefficients. So he didn't just publish a stolen formula, he built an entire mathematical architecture right on top of it. Part 4. Decoding the Gambler's Manual. Now, what's really interesting about this is where we uncover his secret vice, gambling. Cardano wrote a 15-folio page manual called Liber de Ludo Alea, or the Book on Games of Chance. Written in the mid-16th century, it was hidden away and not actually published until 1663. When modern scholars Oystein Orr and S.H. Gould rigorously decoded this hidden text, what they found was just staggering. Cardano was quietly revolutionizing mathematics in the dirty taverns and back alleys of Renaissance Italy. Decades before the famous correspondence between Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat, who are traditionally credited as the fathers of probability, Cardano was already mapping out equiprobable sample spaces. He created frequency tables for dice rolls, calculating exactly how many ways 2 or 3 dice could land. He figured out that to truly understand chance, you have to count all the possible equally likely outcomes. He basically beat Pascal and Fermat to the punch by a full century. Just listen to the formulas he derived from his time at the gambling tables. He conceptualized mathematical expectation, the idea that the value of a bet is proportional to the probability of winning, which we express today as capital P times lowercase p. He cracked compound probability, formulating the power formula for independent repetitions, p to the power of n. He even grasped early concepts of the law of large numbers, noting that the mean number of successes equals the number of trials times the probability. But right alongside these rapid-fire, genuinely groundbreaking mathematical formulas, the manual is completely full of gritty, superstitious advice. He warns his readers about marked cards and loaded dice. He even advises gamblers to sit facing the rising moon to improve their luck. It is this wildly jarring mix of pure, enlightened mathematics and desperate, superstitious alleyway survival.
Part 5. The ultimate historical irony.
This brings us to a conclusion that is just steeped in profound historical irony. For all his intellectual triumphs in medicine and algebra, his personal life was a wreckage, and much of it was exacerbated by the very gambling addiction that fueled his hidden mathematical discoveries. In his later years, looking back on the utter chaos of his life, Cardano wrote a heartbreaking reflection, a bitter lament over lost decades to dice and chess. He agonized over the time, the money, and the reputation he completely destroyed at the tables. He viewed his gambling as a vile, destructive disease that robbed him of peace and family stability. He died in 1576 entirely unaware of the true value of his little book on games of chance. And that leaves us with this fascinating, almost haunting question to ponder. How does a life's greatest, most destructive vice become its most immortal contribution to modern science? Gerolamo Cardano thought his legacy would be his medical cures or his algebraic texts. He viewed his gambling as a source of deep shame. Yet, in trying to master his addiction and somehow beat the odds, he inadvertently birthed the modern science of probability, a mathematical framework that now dictates everything from quantum physics to global finance. It is an incredibly powerful reminder that sometimes human genius is forged not in pristine laboratories, but in the absolute darkest, most chaotic corners of the human experience. Thanks for exploring this incredible life with me.